Hello, this is the fourth video lecture on the topic of adolescent. And in this one, I want to talk about we're going to pick up where we left off. We were talking about cognitive changes in adolescence, that period between 12 and 20. Cognitive referring to how our brains work, how we think differently. And in this chapter, in this lecture, I want to talk about more specifically like personality development and how the cognitive changes influence an adolescent sense of self. So one thing that you might hear adolescents described as is that they're very self-centered, they're very self-absorbed. This is what's referred to as adolescent egocentrism. And yes, in fact, right, that has been demonstrated that one of the normal things that happens during this stage of life is an adolescence becomes more aware of their self. So this is the egocentric thinking. Another concept is something called an imaginary audience. An imaginary audience is a phenomena where adolescents perceive or have the sensation that everyone is watching them, that everyone's going to notice. That's when they say, oh, I can't wear those pants or those shoes because everyone will know I don't have the right thing. Well, as my teenager used to point out to me, Mom, no one's paying attention to what you're wearing because they're all concerned about themselves. So in reality, there's not this huge audience, but that is part of this egocentric thinking that is typical, normal for an adolescent. There's something called a personal fable, and this simply refers to the awareness or the sensation, again, that no one can possibly explain my situation because nothing has ever happened to anybody else like what's happening to me right now. So when in that conflict between adult, teenager, and parent, you can't possibly understand because of this sensation of this personal fable. Another observation that's been made more specifically about adolescence in the United States is a phenomenon called grade inflation, or it's a question, raising a question, is that when we look at intellectual development of American teenagers cross-culturally, we see that American teenagers don't perform very well. They're simply not the smartest on the planet. But yet when we compare grades, American students have very high grades. And so some have asked the question, is that because Americans experience grade inflation? Which I'm not sure how we would answer that question. I guess we would have to establish an international rubric, right, to compare how A's are rewarded or highest marks are rewarded in the United Kingdom versus how the highest marks are rewarded in the United States. Okay, so moving on to self-concept and self-esteem. Self-esteem, I think, is a highly confused or an often misunderstood idea. Think of esteem as regard, right? And positive regard. So the question of self-esteem is, how do I regard myself? How do I think of myself? And we do see during adolescence, we have some gender differences. Up until about middle school, I mentioned this in a previous lecture, up until about middle school, boys and girls have been fairly equal. But when you get to middle school, girls' self-esteem radically or significantly drops. Boys' self-esteem continues to rise, but we see for the first time a gender difference in self-esteem. And again, as I mentioned before, this is theorized as, and really this is what women, women all over our culture experience, is this general female is less than male, right? This general female inferiority that we hear from our culture. We also see the same thing in terms of social class and race-based differences, that when we hit to the early stages of adulthood, we begin to experience the sensation of a patriarchal culture and of a culture that favors white people over people of color. So and this begins sometime around adolescence, starts to show up. Self-concept. So one of cognitively, remember cognitive about thinking, what we see in adolescence about how we think of ourselves is it's shifting from what was referred to as concrete to abstraction. In other words, in elementary school, the way I defined myself was I'm a fast runner. That's concrete, right? It's it's measurable. You can see it. To abstract, things like identities, like I am a feminist, or I am a Christian, or I am a, I don't know, right? So it moves from being concrete to abstract. We also develop a flexible sense of identity, and an ability to comprehend, or ability to imagine ourselves or think of ourselves on a situational basis. So in elementary school, we always were like this. We were always talkative, but we were always shy. In middle school and high school and our teenage years, we begin to recognize that sometimes I'm shy, sometimes I'm not going, right? It all depends. I think hopefully you can sort of see a theme here, that what's happening is the ability to think abstractly. And in adolescence, that our comprehension of the complexities of the world, we understand them more, we become more aware of them. The world is not so much black or white, right or wrong. It becomes more gray. And of course, not everyone develops that capacity to see the gray over the black and white. But this is sort of when it normally develops. Okay. What this slide speaks to are other ways of thinking about how my sense of self, my identity formation is formed. And specifically, we're using Erikson. Remember Erikson? Erikson was the fellow that used the term crisis, that says we go through these different stages and how we come out of them. And he called those crises. And I don't think that's the best word, but that's the one he uses. So the infancy was trust versus mistrust. Somewhere in there we have industry versus, I don't know. So like when the toddlers, they do things, they don't do things. We have two going on during our adolescent years, during our 12 to 20s. One of them is what we call identity versus identity confusion. The other is intimacy versus isolation. Identity versus identity confusion. This is the time where who I am, right? This is the time where a person begins, or is supposed to, or typically explores the question of my identity. Oh, or am I confused with my identity? Erikson theorized that there were these 4 different stages, or 4 different outcomes, 4 different stages that a person could be in during this stage. You could have experienced what he called identity achievement, identity foreclosure, identity moratorium, or identity diffusion. Identity achievement is characterized by someone who uses this period of adolescence. Remember, this period is associated with opportunities and risk. So you take the opportunity, you take risks, and you explore, you try out new things, right? And at the end of it, you have said, okay, I've tried this and I've tried that, and I've tried being a Buddhist, and I've tried being a Christian, I've tried being a Republican, I've tried being a Democrat, and I am this. I have figured out who I am because I have explored. I have achieved my identity, right? Through the process of exploration and research and trying. Identity foreclosure is characterized not by somebody who has tried different things out, but someone who has simply taken what was given to them. You have simply shut down. You have simply foreclosed. You've accepted what your parents say. You've accepted what is expected of you. You don't bother doing anything. You just foreclose on it. You just shut it down. And we become what we're told to become. Your parents have raised you to be a liberal Democrat. You are a liberal Democrat. They have raised you to be a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So that's what you are, right? Never considered anything else. Identity moratorium is a time where it was a period of crisis and exploration. So moratorium is somebody who's kind of in the midst of it. You're right. You're trying out all these different things, and you can't. I don't know. I can't figure it out. I'm really confused. Right. So you haven't. Your identity formation is in essence stopped. Right. A moratorium means it freezes, but in this case, it's frozen by you're still confused. You're right. You haven't achieved your identity, but you're still your identity is not formed because you're in the process of exploring, right? You're confused. I don't know what I am. I don't know where I'm going, right? So in that sense, I'm trying, because I always want to make sure these words sort of work. In that sense, your formation is in moratorium, right? Because you're not formed, and it can be, this can be a really unsettling time. Identity diffusion says is that, well, you kind of gave up, right? You didn't explore, you aren't settled, you're just not interested. You just don't care. You just completely diffused. So the point about, that this is a period of identity formation, and where are you at? Where is a person at? Okay, I'm going to stop this right here for a second. Hold on. Okay, my apologies. Sorry about that. So we were talking about identity status, and I just want to wrap this video lecture up with another identity formation or crisis that's associated with adolescence, and that's this one down here that's referred to intimacy versus isolation. So effectively, what this and I think typically we see intimacy versus isolation also, and also the crisis of young adulthood, because in this case, intimacy refers to how you're going to turn towards people or turn away from people. Intimacy is not sexual intimacy, it's emotional intimacy. So during these stages where we're not assigned to play groups and our parents don't make play dates, this is when we get to decide, how big our social circle is going to be, or are we going to isolate ourselves? What exactly our friendships are going to look like, right? So you go through middle school and into high school, and your relationships begin to shift. What makes for a good friendship shifts, right? It's less about shared interests, and it becomes more about your ability to connect and your ability to understand. And that's what intimacy is, right? Intimacy is not just, sex is part of intimacy, but intimacy is how much I disclose to another person and how much that other person discloses to me. So that is also sort of formed during this period, because a person might be forming their intimacy and their isolation in a virtual setting. I think of my son, who when he went through high school only had a couple really good friends. He has a lot of friends now, but they're friends he has in the virtual environment, but these are very good friends of his that he travels, great distances to be with. Okay. I'm going to stop there simply due to time, and in the next video lecture, I'll talk more about identity, and we'll move on to talking about parents.